So today we're talking about SEO and how your content affects it. Quick overview, here's our presentation. We're going to go over pretty quickly what SEO actually is. We're going to cover how content and SEO kind of relate with each other. And we're going to cover some factors of your content which you can control to improve how your website appears in search engines like Google. We're going to cover some resources, and we're going to make a little bit of time for the Q&A. So what's SEO? And this is just for people who are perhaps not really familiar with the subject, but just so we're all on the same page. SEO is search engine optimization, and it's the process of improving your site's visibility and searchability on search engines like Google. So the goal of search engine optimization is basically to ultimately increase the traffic to your website by improving how your site appears or how high your site appears on a search engine like Google. So search engine optimization influences your site's search rankings and how high your search places on Google. So for example, if you go to universities, some of this might be location dependent since a lot of websites actually track your location. You might see different results from time to time. I actually took this screenshot as a quick example. So even though we're seeing Ohio State at the top of this screenshot, it's actually not even the first that appears on this list. There are at least like 2 or 3 online universities that appeared before Ohio State even came up. And on top of that, it also cuts out that you also had to scroll past some ads and sponsored stuff too, which can get pretty annoying and can bury your search results even further down. So there's some things we can't control in terms of SEO, but this is going to kind of focus on mostly what we can control in terms of, how well our content helps boost our performance. So Google and other search engines basically use trackers and other little bots to basically determine how useful a website is to what's called like a query term, basically the word that you type into Google or phrase to pull up what you're looking for. So Google is essentially looking for what is going to be the most useful or potentially useful website to your search terms. So there's over 200 known factors that influence a Google search ranking. And I type known in parentheses because it's probably gotten to the point where there's maybe even hundreds more as time goes on. This 200 known factor gets thrown around a lot, but that stat actually comes from 2006. So it's no doubt probably exploded to God knows how many other known factors. But that said, content is going to be one of the most important factors that's going to influence how well your site's performing on Google. So there's quite a lot of things that can be considered content. And those things are anything like your basic and landing pages, lists, people pages, news items, newsletters, any embedded social media, videos, slideshows. Variety tends to really be the strong point in terms of what's going to help your site perform. If it's just like a very short little wall of text, Google is probably not going to consider that very useful for a user's search terms. And it's more likely to kind of end up in a lower ranking than other websites that are kind of competing for that same traffic, especially when it comes to online universities too. Essentially, what the goal of Google and other platforms like Google are to deliver the best user experience possible and to find the most useful content for users. Essentially, it helps to kind of keep in mind to think like a search engine almost when you're designing your website. And that really is to kind of keep in mind that search engines are looking to solve a problem or help a user accomplish like a task or satisfy some kind of goal in the end. So keeping that in mind, we're going to touch a little bit on that, what's called user intent, a little bit more in the future. So this is probably where it's going to be like the bulk of our content factors. Like I said, there are over 200 known factors when it comes to influencing Google search results, but Since most of us are working with content and websites, we're going to kind of focus on the things that we can control and things that we can improve on and things that are entirely within like our little world here. And I've tried to kind of keep this as basically entry level as possible, just so everyone kind of has the same base of knowledge that we're kind of working on when we're thinking about search engine optimization here. I kind of broke this down into 6 different factors here. Usability is kind of on the top of this list. There's really no actual real order to this. Accessibility is another major one, and it goes hand in hand with usability. Relevance is probably going to be something that preoccupies you a lot, because that also ties into another one, keywords here. And lastly, there is engagement and intent. So basically, those kind of cover how engaging your content is, how does your content encourage users to interact with your website, how long they interact with your website, and what parts they interact with your website. And basically, intent is kind of just keeping in mind what's the goal here, not just on your end, like the purpose of your page, but what is the goal of someone who is looking this content up. So let's get into the very first one here, usability. So usability, how well does my content provide the best user experience? And how can you improve a user's experience? So when you're kind of creating content or thinking about content or in the planning stages, there's a few ways you can kind of go about that. And that's kind of essentially looking over your content and asking yourself, are my headings clear? Am I using proper headings? So I kind of written down here, H1 tag headings. Those are typically your biggest one. Given the fact that we're working in Drupal, some of the numbers are going to be a bit different. So anything that is H1 is going to be mostly like your page titles. What's the very first thing that your user sees when they come to your page? Everything else, these headings from heading 2 to heading 6, those are more useful for defining the page structure. Those kind of help you categorize things. So headings like the heading 2, that typically is going to be the second largest thing. And those numbers kind of scale down in size. So heading 3 is going to be smaller than that. Heading 4 gets smaller, and so on and so forth. And those kind of help you build the structure of the site. Asking yourself if your content is what's called skim friendly. Typically, a lot of websites go for the most skim friendly websites typically have sentences and content that's about anywhere from 1 to 3 sentences in length. I usually stick to 1 to 2 sentences just to kind of stay safe. If my sentences are going to be pretty short and direct and concise, then I do go for 3. But you don't really want a full paragraph like 4 or 5, because then you're hurting the skim friendly part. Attention spans are pretty hard to kind of keep on websites. It's just the way we engage and interact with the technology. So keeping that in mind, just keeping it kind of short as you can and keeping those paragraphs of content as digestible as you can go a long way to helping people navigate and use your site. Just keeping a logical structure. And sometimes the structure isn't super clear, and that can kind of really kind of defeat the initial purpose of a page to begin with if it's lacking a logical structure and the flow of it doesn't make any sense. And lastly, kind of keeping things in active voice is a great way of condensing content. So when we're using active voice, that's just basically keeping in mind that the subject is doing something rather than the subject. Something is happening to the subject. Usually the best thing about active voice is that it keeps things pretty short and sweet, and it communicates ideas in a way that is essentially a less wordy version. Usually passive voice is a little bit more longer and long-winded. This kind of goes hand in hand with keeping things kind of short and skim friendly too. So accessibility is the one I'm probably going to harp on the most. So basically, the thing to keep in mind always when we're thinking about accessibility is, can someone with a disability access my content as easily as somebody without a disability? Disabilities may include auditory, cognitive, physical, neurological, and visual disabilities. So that's a pretty broad range of stuff to kind of keep in mind. That said, keeping these things in mind kind of really helps you consider, at least when you're in the planning stages of content, how to actually make your content more accessible. And usually doing a little bit more reading and research on each of these can go a long way. There are compliance guidelines that we also have to abide by when we're making content. So keep in mind that, yes, it is required that we kind of follow these guidelines, but it's also the right thing to do just to begin with. And when you kind of keep these in mind, these really, really affect how usable your website is for everyone and how usable your content is for everyone. And usability and accessibility are both really, really critical with your search engine optimization, right? Like I said, accessibility affects your SEO, and it also affects how easily users can navigate the site. It affects how their overall experience is with your website's content and how much easier it makes for them to accomplish the task that they're trying to do with your website. So if you're creating content for, let's say, an undergraduate recruitment program for anything like that, right? Then essentially, the more accessible and usable the site is, the better time that they're going to have with the content that you produce. And that in turn, the more engagement and interaction they have with that content, in turn improves the SEO, since Google tends to track all of this performance. So how do you check for your accessibility? Just making sure you have clear page titles, making sure your headlines are clear and easy to understand. And this is kind of going back to the headings that we mentioned earlier. And this is just a little reminder here, your H1 tag stuff, or your title, essentially. Just kind of keep in mind that heading 1 is always title of the website, and everything else are headings for specific parts of your website. The structure, the building blocks of the website, with heading 2 being the biggest, and it goes in a descending order. It gets smaller as you go down these numbers. And those, again, kind of make sure you're providing a logical, easy to follow structure for anyone with a disability. Accurate anchor text. So if you are in the habit of using anchors, which is great, just make sure that the description, basically the little text that you hover over with your mouse, is accurately describing where is that going to go? Where is that going to take the user on the page? Breadcrumb links. So this is kind of getting more into menus, right? So usually, whether it's your main menu or if it's the sidebar menu that people use a lot for their sites, or if it's like the series of links at the top of a page. So let's say you have an about page and you came from there from your home page. Then the breadcrumb links are going to be home, usually an arrow, and following that arrow, that will be the about page, the page that you're currently on. So basically keeping links that are accurately describing where they take you back to, and they're making sure they're just easy to find, and they're pretty clear as well. Alt text. I usually talk about alt text in almost every presentation I give, but essentially alt text is just the text that anyone using a screen reader can use to accurately describe what an image is. Essentially, the way Drupal is built, if you're trying to upload an image to begin with or use any images on your website, it's going to make you provide an alt text for that. So I would just kind of keep that in mind. It's necessary, and it's also going to make you do it. And I would just really, really insist that you keep it as accurate as possible. It doesn't necessarily have to be a really long description of something that's pretty simple. If the content that you're writing is about somebody who is like a faculty member or anyone like that, then alt text simply with their name or saying this is a photo of this person is usually sufficient. But just kind of keep in mind that keeping it as accurate as possible is the big thing for all of these things here. And again, these things also kind of affect your SEO in the long run. So relevance, this is the one that we would kind of assume is self-explanatory, but sometimes we can when we produce content for a site, we can sometimes lose sight of what our goal is for the site, or how is my content even relevant to what someone is looking for here? How well does my content align with my audience's intent, which is something we'll get to here in a minute. There's several types of relevance I decided to highlight here. You have brand relevance, right? Brand relevance is essentially asking, how close is my content and topic and keywords to my department's like brand or mission, right? Link relevance, how relevant, useful, or arbitrary links are on a page. That one's a little bit more self-explanatory. Just kind of keeping in mind, if you're linking to anything, how important or relevant it is to the content of the page. Essentially, and we're eventually going to get to intent here in a bit. Page relevance, essentially, how relevant are the titles, paragraphs, and keywords are to the content that they're covering. So keywords. Keywords are basically just the terms that you use in any search engine when you're trying to find any content online. Usually, like for here, for example, we have one for keto, keto lunch meal prep, keto lunch on the go, and so on and so forth. Each one of those kind of is its own search term. Even though it's all one phrase that you're using, each single term you type in, Google breaks that down and it combines it to find the most relevant results. And it's also looking for the best performing keywords as well. And when you're creating content in regards to SEO, you want to do a little bit of research beforehand when you're using certain terms, just to see how well they're performing. And from there on, that can kind of help you really inform in the planning stages of what your content's going to look like. So this kind of begins with asking yourself, what search terms are directing traffic to my website? And then this is once you kind of figure out through your analytics reports, you can contact us directly and we can get you a link to your website's report and see what search terms are actually directing people to your website on Google. And after you kind of see what's working and what might not be working, then this is where you kind of get to the second step, where you research what terms are trending, essentially, right? And there's hundreds of different tools you could be using to find keywords that are performing pretty well or not so well. I linked in here Google Ads. You're essentially able to find pretty much anything that you need to with the keyword plan on Google Ads. So I included the image here that covers communications. And we can kind of see how well that's doing every single month. So between 100,000 to 100 million searches just for that word. There's been no change in that, no surprise there. It's a low competition one, which is actually surprising, which means essentially how often is that one being used. So generally, if a keyword is being used at a much higher percentage, then that's going to actually be more competition, meaning more people are using this keyword to get attention. So basically trending content like on Twitter or anything like that, like the tags that people are using and hashtags that people are putting into, when those are trending, then there's more competition for basically attention on those keywords. So on the one hand, yes, it boosts your performance on either Google's algorithm or a website that Google owns, like YouTube's algorithm. On the other hand, the more people that use that, the more competition there is for attention and clicks, which is at the end of the day what we're wanting here. And usually this other information on the far right here, you don't necessarily need to worry about. Those are more people who are paying for advertising, which is something that we, to my knowledge, generally don't really use, but I could be mistaken on that front. But for the most part, given the fact that we're kind of focusing on the content side of things, we're going to leave like the top of page bid stuff. Yeah, keyword tools in general are really, really great way of finding this kind of data. So not only is communications working pretty well, but we also have other keyword ideas that are performing that we could use to kind of influence how, like, what we choose to write into our content, right? So we have interpersonal communications, we have types of communication, mass media, mass communication. These are all perfectly great terms to be using. And they also add a little bit more variety to your website. So you don't really want to focus on a single keyword when you're producing content. You kind of want to like spice it up a bit. So that way Google is pulling from not just one single like repeated keyword, but it's also pulling multiple ones from the content that you make. Engagement. So this kind of ties into what we covered earlier, does tie a bit into engagement, but essentially when we're thinking about engagement, we want to essentially keep in mind that, is my content encouraging the user to interact with my website? Engaging content helps the user accomplish a task with a lot more depth and variety, and it involves using a little bit more of the tools that Drupal has available. So instead of just having, short or long form pieces of text, this would include, adding some multimedia like graphics, video, things like that, social media, using lists, accordions, basically anything that encourages a user to use more of your content and interact more with your web page. This is kind of what we would consider engagement. Not only that, not just getting a user to stick on a page, but to explore other parts of your website, which is what Google will typically track on here. Are they just visiting one website and then exiting, which is what we call the bounce rate. Usually the lower bounce rate we have, the better. But basically engaging content encourages users not just to interact with a single page, but more parts of your website. So that's something we kind of want to encourage when we're making our content. And a good rule of thumb is that good long form content is more useful than short-term content. And it kind of circles back to usability. A lot of these factors kind of circle back to another one. So usability, relevance, things like that, it all kind of keeps coming back. So long form content, and I'm going to get a little bit more into that here in a bit. Long form content has a higher chance of providing the answers that users want. They're usually much more comprehensive and detailed. So that said, long form content in this context is generally no less than 2,000 words. Now, the good news is that you don't actually need to have like a word count for your content to be engaging. It's just usually that websites or search engines like Google typically are looking for longer form content. They use these bots called crawlers to basically search websites for this content. And these crawlers are looking for this kind of stuff right here. So this is the journalism major on the School of Communications website. And I took like a very brief screenshot of that. It doesn't really show you a whole lot here, but essentially this is kind of the standard you want to go for, right? The fact that a lot of these sentences are kind of short and pithy, get to the point, but essentially an entire page like this can be nearly 1,000 words. But so long as it's something structured kind of like this, with content that is digestible, easy to skim, and has some variety. So we have, we're giving users here more reason to interact and engage with the website. So information about the journalism major, like the curriculum sheet, a degree plan, things like that. Those things are great for keeping a user engaged with the website. So even though this particular page, I looked at it, it does not have that 2,000 word minimum or maximum or whatever you want to call it, it's still pretty engaging because it's relevant, it's really usable, it's skim friendly, and it's really, really engaging. So that said, just keep in mind that your length correlates with how a website performs on a Google search. It's not necessarily the cause of it. So even if you have a lot of content on there, the quality of that content is going to also be a major factor. Is the content usable? Is the content accessible? Is it engaging? a big wall of text is not going to be the cause for why your website performs well in Google. And ultimately, really what Google is looking for engagement-wise is that the more engagement your website has, or your content has, for that matter, then that's essentially how Google is determining the value of your website to someone searching up information about, let's say, a communications major, journalism major, things like that. It's looking for value, trying to provide the best user experience possible. And this is something that we can control with basically how we produce our content. And this is going to be the last one I cover here. So intent. Basically, intent is kind of a two-way street in this regard. So on our end, we ask ourselves, do we want like our page to solve a problem? Do we want it to tell a story? Or do we want to just get clicks? And that last one, just get clicks, that's actually a very important thing, because if you decide that, yeah, I just want to direct traffic however I can, it's going to actually ultimately harm how useful your content is to a user. And Google's going to Google is able to kind of tell. There's a very specific term that is kind of slipping my mind, but essentially low value content typically is something that Google's search engine ultimately actually kind of punishes. If it's really long, it's just a bunch of clickbaity keywords, it has like no value or relevance to a search term. Keeping in mind, what's the overall purpose of the page that you're producing? And what is the visitor looking for when they are checking out a page like this one? So this is from the School of Philosophy, right? We can kind of make some pretty good guesses here for why they would have something, why study philosophy. So from the department's standpoint, what's the intent for this page? Are they just trying to answer a question that is just something that's not really important? Or is it to entice people to enroll in the philosophy department at Ohio State? And this content is actually pretty engaging because, again, this is just like a pretty short thing they have, but essentially with these links that they have, they're not only trying to answer the question for someone who might actually consider entering the philosophy program, but also, is there any practical value to that? Which is kind of why I chose philosophy to highlight that, because I feel like the folks at philosophy would want to really drive that home that, yeah, there's things you can do actually with a philosophy degree. Do it for yourself, skills, advanced degrees, jobs, things like that. Needless to say, the philosophy folks are actually making a good argument, which is not a big surprise there. So this is just kind of covering what I already talked about a little bit, but this kind of breaks it down into a little bit more detail, and it's keeping the user intent in mind. Although we kind of talked a lot about why the department would create this page and these pages, but essentially if you're the user and you want to know how can getting a philosophy degree make your life better, then this is the kind of content that you would want to be producing. So for example, the one on the right here, we have a graduate, Rachel Crow, graduated from OSU spring of 20, double majored in philosophy and international studies, basically learned new ways of thinking and challenging herself. But she also did some pretty interesting things, served with AmeriCorps, worked at a research network at Oregon Health, and unfortunately got cut off down there. But the whole point is that this content is satisfying that user intent, right? It's answering the question of what can you do with a philosophy degree? You know, is it going to be worth the time and investment and money that you put in to get a philosophy degree? So this kind of content really focuses on the user's experience and their search intent. Because at the end of the day, it kind of goes back to what Google really cares about, providing the best user experience possible. So when we do that, we not only provide the best user experience we can, but we also improve that search engine optimization on our end. And of course, this is just the resource page that I kind of like to harp on about. So I add all of these presentations to the web services knowledge base. So we update this all the time, basically making sure that everyone who doesn't get to attend a meeting like this gets to view the edited versions in the recorded training archive. And this can also be very, very helpful for answering any questions you have about stuff like images, writing for the web, information about open office hours, and these training presentations.